If we ask the wrong questions, we're going to get the wrong answers. This is the Extreme Stewardship Podcast, where we explore anything and everything that gets us better at making things good and good at making things better. Right now, I'm interested in getting better at one specific thing, and that is knowing and understanding the commander's intent. God has put us on a specific mission, and we need to know what that mission is, why we're doing it, and what the basic parameters are for how we're going to get it done. And that means we need to get better at listening to His explanation of the mission and making sure we understand it. And that means, among other things, growing in our ability to read the Bible. The way we're going to do this, the way we're going to get clarity on our commander's intent, is to come to every biblical text with 5 kinds of questions in mind: literary questions, historical questions, canonical questions, theological questions, and practical questions. Literary questions means the type of literature, the style of literature, that sort of thing. Historical questions means questions about context, culture, economics, politics, geography, all that. Canonical questions means questions about how the text in front of me connects to texts in other parts of the Bible. Theological questions means questions about God, what He's like and what He's doing. And practical questions means questions about what I'm supposed to do to get on board with what God is doing. These last 2 kinds of questions are really the commander's intent, what He wants to do, and what part He wants me to play in doing it. That's the real goal of all this. This is the first episode in which I show the whole process. We're going to choose a text, and we're going to think through these 5 kinds of questions. And since it's the first time we're doing this, we might as well start at the beginning. Genesis 1. I've talked about Genesis 1 in the context of our theology of work and rest in a few earlier episodes of this podcast, so I might end up saying some of the same things I've said before, but in this episode I'm going to teach you how I got there. I'm going to take you on the journey, not just show you the destination. So, first stage, literary questions. What kind of literature is this? Is almost always the very first question we ask every single text. In Genesis 1, there are 2 things worth saying in response to that question. First, it's a story. That means characters, plot, dialogue, that sort of thing. The fact that Genesis 1 is a story also means it has a narrative intent, you might say. It's trying to accomplish something, and that something is going to screen out certain bits of information that might otherwise have been included. If I tell you the story of how I met my wife, I'm not going to tell you every single possible detail. I'm going to pick and choose which details I include, depending on what I, as the storyteller, am trying to communicate to you, my audience. Now, that's not deception, that's storytelling. If my son starts telling me about math class in school today, he isn't going to include much information about the color of the carpet in the hallway outside his classroom, unless the color of the carpet in the hallway outside his classroom is somehow relevant to the story he's trying to tell. Now, the same is true in Genesis 1. It's a story that's only going to include the details that are meaningful for that story. And that leads us to the second thing worth saying in response to the question, what kind of literature is this? Ancient cultures in the relative vicinity of Israel, which in modern terms means the Eastern Mediterranean, the Middle East, North Africa, many of these cultures have left written records of what we might call origins stories. Scholars sometimes call them cosmogonies. How and why did the world get here? How and why did we get here? What sorts of beings beside us are there? That sort of thing. The Babylonians have these, the Egyptians have these, the Greeks have these. All these cultures, Israel included, were interested in telling these stories. How Genesis 1 relates to these other versions of things is a historical question, so we'll wait a minute to get to that. Literarily, the point is that Genesis 1 is in some ways an instance of a known literary genre that tells these stories. So there's the broad category of story and the narrow category of ancient Near Eastern origins stories. And knowing the rules for both is going to help us read Genesis 1 more accurately. Now, even if you only look for a few seconds, you'll notice that Genesis 1 is highly structured. God spoke, it happened, it was good, day 1. God spoke, it happened, it was good, day 2, rinse, repeat. At the same time, though, each day gets a little more involved. The descriptions of days 1 and 2 are quite brief, a bit longer in 3, 4, and 5, and then longer again in day 6. Same basic pattern, but more detail as we go along. The point being, perhaps, that while God is the same God doing the same basic thing on each day, day 6 is special. And the things that God creates on that day are special. And then within day 6, the second thing God creates is set apart from the first thing God creates. The story structure of Genesis 1 is designed to draw our attention to the creation of humanity and wonder just how different humanity is from everything else God made. One other thing about the literature of Genesis 1. There's a lot of repetition, not just overall structure, but words like good and bless and said and saw and evening and morning. Genesis 1 was designed to be simple. Just sit back for a second and think on how much happened on one page in our Bibles. So much, so many things left unsaid, so many questions unanswered. Genesis 1 wasn't trying to do everything. It was trying to use a few simple words and phrases to tell us what we really need to know about what God had in mind when he created the world and everything in it. So from the literary bit, there are now 2 questions that I'm going to take with me as I move into historical questions. First, why tell these details and not others? And second, why use these words and phrases to communicate those details and not others? Engaging some historical questions is going to help me answer those literary questions. Now, there are 2 ways to come at historical questions. One happens when the text itself names something historical or cultural. It identifies a person, a location, an event, a custom, something like that. And it's very obvious that we're seeing something from the historical context of the text that we need to ask some questions about it. There really isn't much of this in Genesis 1. So the other way to come at historical questions is to wonder what historical or cultural things are going on behind the scenes that aren't so obvious. In Genesis 1, we're already set up to come at that question because we've already acknowledged that there are other versions of the origins of the cosmos floating around in the ancient world, and it's worth wondering how Genesis 1 is like or unlike those other accounts, whether it agrees with them or disagrees with them on specific point, things like that. Now, I'm not inviting you to become an expert on ancient Near Eastern cosmogonies. I'm not an expert on ancient Near Eastern cosmogonies. Most of us don't have time for that, and even fewer of us have interest in that. But this is where we let the experts put a few things on the table for us so that we can use those things to come back to the text and ask the right questions. So here's something the experts put on the table for us. Most ancient Near Eastern origin stories are about gods, plural, fighting each other. Somehow, in the aftermath of that, we end up with the world and humans, etc. But the story is mostly about the gods, and it's mostly about conflict. Now, that's not even remotely like Genesis 1. In Genesis 1, there are no gods, only the one God, and there's no conflict. God just says what he wants, and it happens. Now, here's another thing the experts have discovered for us. Most cosmogonies are ethnocentric. In the Babylonian accounts, it's the Babylonian gods who win the war. In the Egyptian accounts, likewise. The story legitimates whichever political reality is telling it. Again, not so much in Genesis 1. Now, this is interesting. There's a Jewish document from a little before the time of Jesus, long after Genesis 1 is written down, and this document, called Jubilees, retells the creation story, but it adds one thing and subtracts another. It adds the claim that God's Sabbath rest, which we learn about on day 7 of creation, was only for Israel, not for other nations. And Jubilees subtracts the part about humanity, all humanity, being created in God's image. So it takes out the part about all humans being equal, and it adds a part about Israel being special. Now, that's the sort of thing that was already happening in other ancient creation accounts, but not happening in Genesis 1. Genesis 1 says humans, male and female, full stop. No ethnic distinctions at all. Now, one more thing the experts have figured out. The idea of humans being in the image of the gods isn't original to Genesis. I mean, by the time Moses wrote it down, assuming he's the one who wrote it down, ancient people had been talking about being the God's image for centuries. But that imaging function was very precisely limited to one group of people: kings. Kings are the ones who get the privilege of representing the gods in the world and ruling on their behalf. But in Genesis, it's everyone, men and women, all men and women. And that tells us something both about the value of every single human being on the planet, and it tells us something about the commander's intent for every single human being on the planet. Quick pause here to tell you about a couple of things we have going on besides this podcast. If you'd like to spend some time with other people who are excited about the theology of work and rest, who want to grow as stewards who act in keeping with their commander's intent, we've got a conference happening in Canton, Ohio. It's called the Good Work Conference. It's on September 28th, and there's a link to the conference website in the show notes of this episode. We also have something called Kibbe Consulting, where we do organizational leadership development. There's a link for that in the show notes as well. When someone tells a story, there are two historical moments in view: when the story happened and when the story was told. Now, so far, I've only mentioned when the story was told, the historical context of Genesis being written down. But you probably know that the real deal for a lot of people is the historical moment of Genesis 1 itself, the historicity of the creation account. If you've heard of the Institute for Creation Research, Answers in Genesis, Ken Ham, maybe you've been to visit the Ark in Kentucky, or maybe you've had debates about creation and evolution, literal six-day creation versus gap theories, day-age theory, all that sort of thing. And I want to say here that when it comes to a story being told, the historical context of the story being told is inevitably going to limit what we can know about the historical context of the story taking place. In other words, no matter what happened back in the very beginning, the only thing I can learn from Genesis 1 is what Genesis 1 tells me. And what Genesis 1 wants to tell me is significantly constrained. I'm not going to say entirely constrained, but significantly constrained by the story that it wants to tell its own historical moment. Now, there is a canonical set of questions about this that have to do with a New Testament author suggesting that an Old Testament text means something that's hard to validate in terms of the human Old Testament author having in mind. That's a different issue. Here I'm really going for the point that asking Genesis 1 to answer modern scientific questions is historically dangerous. So if, let's say, the biblical creation account was written to a world in which polytheism was the norm and gods killing other gods is how we got here, those are the sorts of issues that biblical account is going to address. I should ask Genesis 1 how God's creative action overturns polytheism, because that's the question Genesis 1 wants to answer. And maybe at a minimum, I should put a lot more energy into asking that question than into asking how God's creative action overturns Darwin, because that's not the question Genesis 1 could have ever imagined answering. Now, maybe I just made a lot of people mad. I don't know, but here's my point. Let the text identify the right questions. Part of doing that is recognizing that the text was given by God to speak into a historical moment, and it is initially going to address the questions of their moment rather than of ours. Genesis 1 is a challenge to certain wrong ideas about God and the world, but those wrong ideas are Babylonian rather than Darwinian. Now, it might be that Darwin also runs aground on Genesis 1, but asking historical questions prevents us from making that the main point. I want to pick up what this text is actually laying down. But if we ask the wrong questions, we're going to get the wrong answers. Canonical questions. We'll get to Genesis 3 in a couple of episodes, but we can anticipate it now as a fulcrum. Things are going to change radically in Genesis 3. But we're not there yet, which means Genesis 1 describes the world as God intends it to be. That's what the word good means. When God creates something and calls it good, that means whatever he just created is able to do whatever he created it to do. Now, it obviously hasn't yet done all that he created it to do because we just got here, but it can do what he designed it to do. The point being, anything that shows up before Genesis 3 is good. The exception that proves the rule is when God says it's not good for the man to be alone in Genesis 2. So he solves that problem on the spot. Once God has finished creating things, including Eve, things are the way they're supposed to be, the way God designed them to be. That means humans ruling over the rest of creation is what God designed them to do. It means man and woman, together but different, is how God designed us to be. It means life rhythms. Hang on, I better back up on this one. Genesis 1:14. One of the reasons why God created the sun, moon, and stars was to provide us with markers for our various life rhythms, daily, monthly, yearly, etc. This includes some really basic stuff like knowing when to plant and when to harvest, when to sleep and when to rise, all that. It also includes, and unfortunately you can only see this in some English translations, what some Bibles call sacred times. That means festivals, holidays, that sort of thing. It means times to stop working and notice that somehow the world keeps spinning on its axis without us causing it to do so. Before sin, before death, before everything became not the way it's supposed to be, God built into the cosmos itself natural rhythms for us to live by. Now, Genesis 2 is going to give us more information on what those rhythms are, but just knowing they're there is an indication of how God wants us to live as his stewards in the world. Fourth kind of questions, theological questions. Genesis 1 is about God. I mean, that's not surprising, is it? He's the only speaker. He's the only actor. No one else does anything in the story itself. The closest you come to anyone else doing anything is the affirmation that the plants did what God told them to do in verse 12. I mean, this story is about God. So the question, what does this story say about who God is and what he's like and what he's up to? That's a great question because that's what the story is mostly about. Now, if you've followed this podcast for a while, you've heard this before. What God is up to is moving things from chaos to order. Let's put water here, dry land there. Fish go in the water, birds go in the air. Let's get this thing organized. He's also moving things from unproductive to productive. Those plants need fruit, so they can send out seed to grow more plants, which in turn produce more fruit. Now, obviously, there's a lot more we could say across the whole Bible about what God is doing in the world. But in Genesis 1, order and productivity take center stage. Now, the question, how, is an interesting one. How does God make things happen? Well, he speaks. That's it. He'll get his hands dirty in Genesis 2. This is anticipated by the fact that when it comes to creating us, Genesis 1 doesn't tell us how he did it. Genesis 2 will fill in those details. But here in Genesis 1, God only does two things. He talks, and then he sees. He says what should be the case, and then he sees that it is the case. The world as it should be is a world in which what God says goes. Now, one last thing that I notice theologically in Genesis 1. Genesis 1 is really short. Right? Take day 5. Everything that lives in the water, everything that lives in the air, every fish, mollusk, whale, bird, flying insect, I mean, the list goes on and on. Check this out. Right now, scientists have identified and cataloged about 1 million different species of insects. They estimate, meaning they guess, the total number is somewhere between 2 and 30 million. Now think about that. Between 2 and 30 million species of insects. When my family moved to Thailand in 1993, we were told that the population of Bangkok was somewhere between 8 and 15 million people. In other words, we have no idea how many people there are in this city. So to say that the number of insect species, not individual insects, but species of insects, is between 2 and 30 million is to say we have no idea, really, just how much variety there is in one group of creatures that God has made. Genesis 1 says it so briefly, but that brevity just draws our attention to the unimaginable range of things that is happening between the lines. God is not monochrome. God loves variety. And now we come to the payoff. practical questions. The practical questions are pretty easy, really, because Genesis 1 so clearly says, hey, humans, you are made in God's image, and that means ruling over the world that he created and representing him to it. So the question is simply, what is God doing that we are supposed to imitate? And the answer is sitting there right in front of us. Rule God's world and act like he does in that process. So the practical points are almost a rerun of the theological ones. Make creation more orderly. That's what God does. Make it more productive. That's what God does. Enjoy limitless variety. That's what God does. And look at all that activity and call it good. The effort it takes to rule God's creation as he intended for us to do is good. God created the world to continue unfolding. He made it dynamic, not static. He wanted it to keep changing, and he wanted us to oversee that process. That's not a post-fall reality. That's not an effect of sin. It's good. And it dignifies all of us so far beyond what the Babylonians and Egyptians and Hittites could have ever imagined. And it dignifies what we do far beyond what most of us are used to thinking. We are used to thinking that the mission of God in the world is just the mission of getting people saved. That's it. The only thing that lasts forever is the Word of God in the souls of people. That's heresy. That's Gnosticism, not Christianity. Go back to episode 14 of this podcast if you want more on that. God created us to partner with him in his mission of bringing order and productivity and beauty into his world. That's the good work that all of us have been invited to do. That is your commander's intent. So, literary questions, historical questions, canonical questions, theological questions, and practical questions, all in service to a singular question: what is my commander's intent? I want to know the mission, I want to know why we're doing the mission, and I want to know the parameters that he has for this mission and my part in it. So I pick up my Bible and I start asking questions. This episode was about Genesis 1. Next episode is about Genesis 2. Thanks for listening to the Extreme Stewardship Podcast. My name is Michael Kibbe, and I teach Bible and theology at Great Northern University in Spokane, Washington. My behind-the-scenes partner in this project is my brother, Ben Kibbe. Our editor-in-chief is Liam Olmsted. Art comes from Leah Leanhoutz, and of course, music is provided by Dave Murray of Daradoon Guitars. If this series has been helpful or challenging to you, or if you've got a story about extreme stewardship that you'd be willing to share, shoot us an email, extremestewards@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you. You are, of course, welcome to like and subscribe and tell your friends and all that. What we really care about is that you have gotten better at making things good and good at making things better.